At night, when the wind softens and the waves breathe instead of roar, the water carries voices, low, salt-worn voices that never made it into books. These are not the songs of victorious captains or the shouts of men raised on statues. These are quieter stories, women's stories, pirate women's stories. And most of all, the stories of what happened after the flags were torn down, after the pistols were taken away, after the courts stopped listening. In the age of sails and shadows, a female pirate was not supposed to exist. She was an error in the rules of the world, a living contradiction. Yet they sailed anyway, disguised or defiant, hidden or bold women who chose the uncertain freedom of the sea over the certain prison of land. Some fled forced marriages. Some fled hunger. Some fled silence. Some simply loved the ocean too fiercely to stay ashore. They learned quickly that freedom had a price. When a pirate ship was captured, the men were hanged, branded, or forced into naval service. Their fates were brutal but expected. The women, however, faced something more confusing, more unpredictable, and often more cruel, because no one could agree on what to do with them. Courts stared at them as curiosities. Crowds whispered. Priests prayed louder than necessary. Judges leaned forward, squinting, as if staring long enough might turn these women back into something acceptable. Some were accused of witchcraft. After all, what kind of woman commanded a ship, or fired a cannon, or lived among men without shame? The sea had always frightened landfolk, and women who mastered it frightened them more. Others were declared mad. Insanity was easier than explanation. Many were simply erased. Take Anne, though, that was not the name she was born with, and not the name she died under. She had sailed for 7 years before capture, her hair cut short, her voice trained low, her hands calloused enough to pass for any man's. When her ship was taken near Jamaica, she did not cry out. She did not beg. She stood with her wrists bound and stared at the horizon as if memorizing it. At trial, when her true identity was revealed, the courtroom gasped, not in sympathy, but in fascination. A woman pirate was entertainment. A woman pirate was a warning. They spared her the rope not out of mercy, but confusion. Instead, she was sent to a colonial prison, a stone place damp with rot and resignation. There she faded, not dramatically, not violently, but quietly, which was often worse. Records show her name once more, then never again. This was the most common ending, not execution, not freedom, but disappearance. Some women were forced back into proper lives. Governors arranged hasty marriages, as if a ring could undo years of gunpowder and salt. These women became wives with sea dreams, mothers with scars no one asked about. At night, when their homes were quiet, they sometimes pressed an ear to the ground, convinced they could hear waves where none existed. Others were sold. Indentured servitude awaited many captured female pirates, especially those without powerful names, to protect them. They worked sugar fields until their backs bent permanently. They worked kitchens where the smell of smoke replaced the smell of salt. They worked silence into themselves, because speaking had never saved them before. A few were shipped across oceans not as sailors but as cargo. Their crimes followed them, whispered in new languages. Just enough to keep them watched. Never enough to explain them. And then there were the ones who vanished between punishments. Ships sank, records burned, bribes were paid. A woman might step off a prison ship and never be seen again, not because she escaped, but because no one cared enough to notice. These women became ghosts long before they died. Sleepy legends grew around them. Fishermen spoke of women walking beaches at dawn, boots in hand, staring at the horizon with practiced eyes. Tavern keepers told stories of quiet women who drank rum like sailors and left coins too old to be common. Some claimed the sea took them back not as pirates but as something else. As keepers. As watchers. And maybe that was kinder. History likes clean endings, hangings, trials, final words. But female pirates rarely received such clarity. Their endings blurred into fog and bureaucracy and boredom and fear. The world didn't know what to do with women who had tasted freedom, so it tried to make them forget it. The sea, however, did not forget them. It remembered the way they learned stars instead of prayers, the way they trusted wind more than law, the way they stood taller on a deck than they ever did on land. And sometimes, when the night is calm and the water moves like breath, the sea still tells their stories, not loudly, not urgently, but softly, like a lullaby meant only for those drifting toward sleep. Have you ever wondered what happened to the legendary female pirates after the battles were lost and the ships were taken? We hear the thrilling tales of Anne Bonny and Mary Read fighting side by side, but their stories, like many others, often end at their capture. What came next? The reality was far from a swashbuckling adventure. It was a descent into a world designed to erase them. The nights after capture were the hardest. It wasn't the chains or the hunger that gnawed at them. It was the silence. For women who had lived their lives by the constant rhythm of the waves, the quiet was suffocating, like trying to breathe without air. In damp, dark cells, they lay awake, straining to hear the familiar sounds of the sea, the slap of water against the hull, the creak of the rigging, the whisper of wind in the sails. But all they heard were coughs, rats, and the distant, unfamiliar sorrows of other prisoners. Some were held below ground, where daylight was just a rumor. Others were kept on old ships converted into floating jails, anchored just far enough from shore to be a constant, cruel reminder of the freedom they had lost. The authorities often kept the female pirates separate, not out of any sort of respect, but out of fear. They worried these women would corrupt the others, spreading dangerous ideas about choice, freedom, and refusal. But the truth was, the world couldn't undo what had already been done. These women had crossed a line, and the world had no idea how to redraw it. Take the story of a woman who called herself Eliza Gray. She was a navigator, a true artist of the stars, whose skill put many male sailors to shame. When her ship was taken near the Canary Islands, she wasn't beaten. Instead, she was endlessly questioned. How did a woman learn navigation? Who taught her? Why didn't she just stay ashore and marry a rich man? Her answers were simple and infuriating to the court. She learned by watching. She sailed because she could. She stayed at sea because she wanted to. None of this was acceptable. The court couldn't quite call her a criminal deserving of the gallows, but she certainly wasn't innocent. So they declared her unnatural and sentenced her to a convent. It was praised as a merciful act, but in reality it was a slow, deliberate erasure of her identity. Behind her stone walls and vows of silence, Eliza learned to navigate a new set of stars. The cracks in the ceiling above her bed, the flicker of candlelight on the wall. The rules of the convent were heavier than any chains she had ever worn. Over the years, her hands, once calloused from rope and tiller, grew soft. The fire in her eyes dimmed. When she finally passed away, her grave was marked with a name that wasn't hers and a prayer she never believed in. History recorded it as a success, a wild soul tamed. Then there were the trials that turned into public spectacles. Crowds would flock to see these women pirates as if they were exotic animals in a traveling circus. They'd whisper about the men's clothes they wore, the commands they shouted, the rumored cruelties and passions. Pamphlets, the tabloids of their day, spun wild tales, painting them as either terrifying monsters or seductive temptresses, whatever sold the most copies. The reality, that most were simply skilled, disciplined sailors who survived on their wits and stubbornness, was just too boring for the public. One woman, known only as Red Mara, was paraded through a port city. Her hands were bound, but her head was held high. The crowd wanted to see tears, but she gave them none. When the judge asked if she regretted her crimes, she shot back that her only regret was getting caught. The courtroom gasped. The audacity. Her sentence wasn't death, but transportation exile to a distant, brutal colony where freedom was just a forgotten word. She fell ill on the long voyage. Fever claimed her somewhere between ports, and her body was returned to the sea without ceremony. In a way, it felt like a quiet kind of justice. She had returned to the ocean that was her true home. But not all endings were so final. For some, the worst punishment was simply surviving. Imagine waking up every day in a life that feels like it belongs to someone else. A life where your past has to be a buried secret, where you can smell the salt in the air but are forbidden from ever touching the water again. Many former female pirates ended up as dock workers, fishmongers, or mending sales jobs that kept them agonizingly close to the life they had lost. They learned to keep their mouths shut. They learned that their stories were dangerous. But sometimes they slipped. Late at night in a rowdy tavern, a woman might casually correct a sailor's boastful, inaccurate tale about navigating a storm. Or she might, without thinking, retie a faulty knot with practiced ease. A sudden silence would fall over the room. Someone would laugh nervously, someone else would quickly change the subject, and the woman would say no more, retreating back into her shell. And what about the children? Female pirates who had children after being captured faced a unique kind of torment. They were told to forget their past for the sake of their sons and daughters. Many tried, and some even succeeded. But others passed down something wordless, something in the blood, a deep understanding of the tides, a restlessness on solid ground, a defiant spirit. Generations later, in port towns all across the globe, there were girls who stared at ships for a little too long, and boys who felt an unexplained urge for the horizon with no idea where it came from. Perhaps it was memory, traveling through bloodlines. But the most dangerous fate of all, believe it or not, was mercy. On rare occasions, a female pirate would be publicly pardoned. It was a PR move for the crown, proof of its benevolence. She would be released, but with strict conditions: never sail again, never leave her assigned town, and never, ever speak of her past. She would smile, bow, and thank her saviors, while inside something turned to stone. Because this kind of mercy demanded gratitude, and gratitude demanded silence. These women often lived long lives. They married, they grew old, and they died in beds instead of in the chaos of a storm. History books would call that a happy ending, but the sea knew better. The sea whispered of the nights these women dreamed of rigging under their hands and a canopy of stars overhead. It whispered of the constant ache in their bones, the ache of knowing they had once belonged to something vast, lawless, and truly alive. As the centuries rolled on, the specific stories faded, names dissolved, dates blurred. What's left are fragments, court records with missing pages, half-burned letters, and rumors repeated so many times that truth and fiction have become impossible to untangle. And yet the echoes remain. You can hear them in old ports where some women still walk with a sailor's confident stride. You can hear them in lullabies sung near the water. You can feel them in the way the sea sometimes grows quiet, as if it's listening. The sea is patient. It holds these stories, waiting. And sometimes in the quiet of the night, it releases them, letting them drift across our dreams like ghost ships under starlight, their sails full, their course unmarked, free once more. Thanks for joining me on this journey into the forgotten history of female pirates. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into the hidden corners of the past. See you next time. There are places the sea speaks more clearly than others. Old harbors where stones remember footsteps. Islands where no flags fly anymore. Narrow channels where the wind changes its mind without warning. In such places, stories of captured female pirates did not end. They softened, stretched, and settled into the world like mist. In the Caribbean, elders once spoke of women who appeared after storms, walking the beaches barefoot, gathering debris with practiced efficiency. They never stayed long. They never asked for help. By morning, they were gone, leaving behind neat piles of salvaged wood and rope, as if tiding the aftermath of chaos was second nature. No one questioned them. In the Mediterranean, there were rumors of women who served as healers in coastal villages, their knowledge of wounds too precise to come from land alone. They stitched flesh the way one might stitch sailcloth, firm and calm, telling no stories unless pressed, and even then. Their words moved like waves around sharp rocks, never directly touching the truth. These women were rarely young. Time had done its quiet work on them. Their hair had faded. Their hands bore scars that no longer surprised them. Capture had taken the sea from their daily lives, but not from their bodies. Salt lingered in their posture, in the way they leaned into wind, in how they trusted instinct more than instruction. Some of them had escaped punishment entirely not through daring rescues or dramatic mutinies, but through something far simpler. They were underestimated. A woman in chains was often seen as harmless. Guards looked away. Doors were left unlatched. Records were filed carelessly. A woman might be sent to one place and arrive in another, unnoticed, unremarked. Bureaucracy swallowed people whole in those days, and women pirates learned to slip through its gaps. They changed names the way sailors changed routes. One such woman, remembered only as Isla, was captured near the coast of Ireland. She spoke little, answered questions vaguely, and cried at the right moments. Her captors decided she was a follower, not a leader, a passenger rather than a pirate. She was released into a coastal town with a warning and a prayer. By spring, she was gone. Years later, a fast, quiet vessel harassed merchant ships in the North Sea, never killing, never lingering, striking with uncanny precision. Sailors swore its captain never raised her voice, never wasted motion, never showed her face. Authorities dismissed the rumors. They always did. But not every woman found her way back to the water. Many lived the rest of their lives under watchful eyes, carrying invisible sentences. They learned how to make themselves smaller, how to speak less, how to fold their histories into neat shapes that fit other people's comfort. This shrinking did not mean surrender. It meant survival. In kitchens and laundries and workshops, former pirates taught younger women quiet lessons. How to hide valuables, how to read weather, how to leave when staying became dangerous. These lessons were never framed as rebellion. They were framed as practicality. The world allowed practicality. And so resistance continued, disguised as advice. At night, when sleep came slowly, these women revisited the moments just before capture, not the fear, but the clarity. The sudden sharpening of senses. The knowledge that whatever happened next, they had lived fully if only for a while. That knowledge mattered. It mattered in the way they faced hardship without panic. In the way they endured loneliness without dissolving. In the way they never mistook obedience for peace. As generations passed, the language around piracy changed. Men remained villains or heroes, depending on who told the story. Women faded into footnotes, if they appeared at all. Historians argued about whether they were real, whether they were rare, whether they mattered. The sea did not argue. It carried on, indifferent to debate, remembering every hand that had trusted it. Sometimes late at night, sailors reported seeing lanterns moving across dark water where no ships should be. They followed these lights briefly before losing them, confused but unharmed. Old sailors would nod knowingly and say nothing. Those lights, they claimed, belonged to women who had died between worlds, not fully claimed by land, not fully released by sea, women who never stopped navigating. And then there were the final endings, the quietest ones. Women who lived long enough to grow old, who sat near shorelines with grandchildren at their feet, telling stories that sounded like fiction. In these stories, the sea was not cruel or romantic. It was practical, demanding, honest. The children listened, unsure why these tales felt heavier than ordinary bedtime stories. Years later, some of those children would stand on docks, staring at ships with a familiar ache, feeling the pull of something older than memory. Perhaps that is how female pirates truly survived. Not in records, not in legends, but in restlessness passed forward. In refusal to accept small lives as destiny. In the quiet understanding that freedom, once tasted, never fully disappears. And as sleep deepens, as thoughts loosen and drift, these stories fold themselves into dreams, not as warnings, not as tragedies, but as gentle reminders. That the sea once welcomed women who refused to be still, that the world punished them for it, and that somehow, softly, stubbornly, they endured. As the night grows deeper, the stories slow their pace, moving the way tides do when the moon sits high and unhurried. This is where endings blur, where history stops insisting on certainty and allows rest. Long after courts closed their books and prisons collapsed into dust, the traces of female pirates lingered in unexpected ways. Not as monuments or names carved into stone, but as habits, instincts, and silences that made no sense unless you knew where to look. In some coastal villages, women always tied knots a particular way, stronger, quicker, more suited to storms than daily life required. No one remembered why. It was simply how it was done. In others, women taught their daughters to swim before they could properly walk, whispering that water was not something to fear, only something to respect. These lessons were given casually, almost absent-mindedly, as if learned in another lifetime, because they had been. For those female pirates who survived capture and lived to old age, memory became a place both comforting and dangerous. They learned to visit it gently, like returning to a harbor after dark. Too much remembering could unravel the careful lives they had built. Too little would make them feel hollow. So they remembered selectively. They remembered stars but forgot names. They remembered motion but forgot violence. They remembered freedom without explaining how it had been taken. When death came for them, it rarely announced itself loudly. It arrived like calm weather after a long crossing. Some died in beds. Some died in chairs facing windows that looked out toward water. Some died with hands that twitched as if adjusting unseen sails. No one thought this strange. Burials were simple. A few prayers. A few tears. The dead were labeled as wives, widows, laborers, mothers. The sea received no mention. And yet, after some funerals, the water nearby behaved oddly. Currents shifted. Fish gathered where they usually did not. Boats drifted less than expected, as if held briefly in place. Sailors noticed. They always noticed. Among sailors, there has long been a belief that the sea claims its own eventually, even if it must wait decades to do so. Female pirates, especially those denied proper endings, were thought to be claimed gently welcomed back rather than taken. This belief brought comfort, because if the sea remembered them, then their lives had not been mistakes. In old ship logs, there are entries that make no sense to historians. Mentions of women appearing on decks during fog, giving quiet directions, then vanishing before dawn. Notes about sudden clarity in storms, as if someone unseen had corrected the ship's course. These entries are usually dismissed as fatigue, superstition, or exaggeration. But sailors read them differently. They read them as gratitude. Not all spirits wander, the sea seems to say some guide. And perhaps that is the final fate of the captured female pirate. Not punishment, not erasure, but transformation. From outlaw to memory, from memory to instinct. From instinct to quiet influence. A woman who once stood trial might later become the reason a ship avoided disaster. A woman who once wore chains might later become the calm that steadied frightened hands. A woman who once lost everything might later become something no court could touch. This is not justice as humans understand it. It is balance. As sleep settles in fully now, these stories no longer demand attention. They do not need to convince or explain. They drift the way all true stories eventually do into the background, into the body, into the spaces where meaning rests rather than argues. The sea grows darker, smoother. Stars hold their places. The women who once defied the world settle into their truest element, not as criminals, not as legends, but as part of the endless rhythm of movement and return. And somewhere between waking and dreaming, the listener understands without needing words. That freedom can be taken, but not unlearned. That silence can hide survival. That some lives, no matter how history treats them, refuse to vanish. The tide turns, the water breathes. And the stories at last sleep. Sleep has a way of opening doors that history keeps firmly shut. In that half-dream space, where time loosens its grip and names stop mattering, the stories of captured female pirates continue not as written records, but as sensations. Imagine the slow roll of a ship beneath bare feet. The weight of damp air just before the rain. The deep calm that settles in when danger is a familiar companion and fear has already been spent. There were women whose captures were never even written down. They simply vanished between ports, between reports, between the moments when someone might have bothered to ask. A woman taken from a ship might be listed as lost, assumed drowned, or just not listed at all. These women entered a quieter kind of fate, neither punished nor pardoned, but absorbed. They were absorbed into towns that didn't know what they were receiving. A woman might arrive inland with nothing but a small bundle of clothes and a habit of always watching doors. She might take the kind of work no one else wanted, and she would likely sleep lightly for the rest of her life. People would sense something unusual about her, not threatening, just alert. They would find themselves trusting her in emergencies. She would just know what to do. You see, captured female pirates carried with them a profound understanding of collapse. They had seen order dissolve in an instant, had lived in spaces where rules changed with the weather and power shifted without any warning. This made them excellent survivors of quieter disasters, fires, famines, outbreaks of sickness. When others panicked, they moved. When others waited for permission, they acted. No one ever thanked them properly, but no one really needed to. Survival was its own language. As empires expanded and laws hardened, the idea of piracy became less romantic and more bureaucratic. Punishments were standardized. Mercy became a rarity. For women captured later in history, there was less confusion about their fate, but also less curiosity. They were no longer spectacles. They were simply problems. These women were imprisoned for longer, worked harder, and spoken about less. Their defiance was worn down not by sudden violence, but by endless repetition. Day after day of grueling labor stripped the drama from their rebellion. Still, something always remained. A woman breaking rocks under a watchful eye might pause, squint at the sky, and predict a storm long before anyone else sensed it. A woman hauling water might correct a guard's poorly tied knot without even looking up. These small moments were reminders that skill doesn't vanish just because it's inconvenient. At night, these women dreamed differently. Their dreams didn't replay trauma, they replayed motion. They dreamed of movement without a destination, of endless horizons, of work that made sense. They woke up tired but somehow intact. Their dreams became their last unregulated territory, a final slice of freedom. And then, eventually, time did what punishment never could. It softened everything. Guards aged. Laws changed. Records decayed. The women grew old enough to be ignored. Old age granted them a strange, unexpected liberty. Society no longer watched them so closely, assuming their danger had passed with their youth. And this was when some of them smiled for the first time in years. You might have seen them. Old women with pirate pasts, sitting near the water, feeding birds. They carved small boats from driftwood and gave them to children. They spoke kindly but firmly and never with an apology. If you asked about their lives, they'd skillfully deflect. If you didn't ask, they simply rested. There is a particular kind of peace that comes not from victory but from sheer endurance. Captured female pirates knew this peace intimately. It didn't erase their loss, but it placed it gently among all the other truths of their lives. They had lived widely. They had made choices, both bad and good. They had been punished for refusing to accept limits. And through it all, they had lived. As sleep deepens, the sea itself grows quieter, almost respectful. The waves no longer speak in full sentences. They just murmur. They hum, repeating rhythms that are older than guilt or law. Somewhere in that sound, the women finally settle, not as exceptions, not as warnings, but as part of the long human effort to move freely, even if it's just for a moment, even imperfectly. Their stories no longer need telling. They are already where stories go when they have finished their work, inside our breath, inside our dreaming, inside the soft certainty that not all endings are loud. And not all freedom has to be witnessed to be real. The water darkens, the mind drifts, and the night holds everything gently, without judgment, until morning decides to arrive. Thank you for watching. The night still has a little room left. Not for action, not for struggle, but for the last gentle echoes. The kind that drift long after a sound has ended and you're not sure whether you heard it or dreamed it. Long after the final female pirates have been captured, punished, pardoned, forgotten, or folded back into ordinary lives, the world continued to behave as if something subtle has changed. No one announced it, no law recorded it. But the edges of things felt different. Ports grew used to women who did not flinch at storms. Towns grew used to women who left without explanation. Families grew used to daughters who asked questions that had no polite answers. This was not rebellion. It was residue. Captured female pirates had left behind a faint disturbance in the idea of what was possible. Even when their names were erased, the disturbance remained like a tide that continues to pull even after the moon has moved on. There were moments, centuries later, when women stood at shorelines and felt an unexplainable calm instead of fear. Moments when danger clarified instead of paralyzed. Moments when obedience felt heavier than risk. These moments did not come from books. They came from somewhere older. Somewhere salt-stained. And perhaps this is the quiet truth history never learned how to write. That capture did not end these women's lives as pirates. It only ended their visibility. Because piracy was never just about ships or theft or flags. It was about choosing movement over stillness. It was about trusting one's own judgment in a world determined to deny it. It was about stepping beyond assigned borders and surviving the consequences. That choice did not vanish when chains appeared. It adapted. So when people ask what happened to female pirates after capture, the honest answer is not dramatic enough for legend and not neat enough for history. They lived. They lived with memory braided into silence. They lived with skills disguised as habits. They lived with freedom folded inward where no court could reach it. And when they died, whether young or old, remembered or forgotten, the sea did not rush to claim them or reject them. It simply received them the way it receives everything eventually, without judgment, without hurry. The waves did not ask for apologies. They never do. Now the water is dark and smooth, like glass. The stars seem farther away. Thought loosens its grip, and the mind drifts the way a boat drifts when no one is steering and no one needs to. The stories have done their work. They no longer need to speak. They rest somewhere between memory and tide, between history and dream waiting only to be felt again, quietly, by someone who understands why the sea has always sounded like freedom, even when it has taken so much away. And with that understanding, sleep settles fully, deep and steady, like an anchor finding sand at last. There is almost nothing left to say now, and that is exactly how the night prefers it. Words begin to thin. The way fog thins before morning, not disappearing all at once but loosening, letting space appear between thoughts. The sea in this final quiet is no longer telling stories, it is simply breathing. In that breathing, the last traces of the captured women settle into stillness. They are no longer pirates, no longer prisoners, no longer symbols or arguments or exceptions. They are balance. Somewhere far back in time, a woman once stood on a deck knowing she might not survive the next sunrise, and she accepted it without fear. That acceptance became a kind of wisdom that could not be confiscated. It traveled forward, passed hand to hand, generation to generation, until it no longer needed a name. That wisdom says, you can lose everything and still remain yourself. You can be restrained without becoming small. You can be forgotten and still matter. The sea learned this early. It learned it from watching women endure what was never designed for them, and still refuse to disappear completely. It learned it from how quietly they adapted, how patiently they waited, how carefully they chose when to move and when to be still. This is why the sea feels different at night. Not dangerous, not gentle, just aware. And now, as sleep finally closes in fully, the awareness softens too. The water does not watch anymore. It rests. The stars dim just enough to be background rather than guide. The horizon dissolves. Nothing is required. Nothing is expected. The women who once lived between law and wave are no longer tense, no longer resisting, no longer proving anything. They drift where all things drift in the end, into the quiet certainty that having lived fiercely, even briefly, was enough to change them. Enough to change the world slightly. Enough. The tide completes its turn. The sea grows still. And sleep, deep and untroubled, takes over, holding every story gently, without asking it to wake again. The night opens again, just a little, the way it does when sleep is deep but not yet finished with you. This is the stretch where thoughts no longer feel like thoughts. They feel like slow water moving under a hull you trust. Nothing urgent. Nothing sharp. Only motion, steady and forgiving. Long after the world stopped looking for them, the women who had once been captured carried on in ways so quiet they blended into ordinary life. That ordinariness was their final disguise, and it was the most effective one. They became women who woke early without alarms. Women who packed lightly even when staying. Women who noticed exits without appearing anxious. They were calm in storms and impatient with false authority, not loudly, not rebelliously. Just enough to refuse being owned by it. In some towns, people spoke of grandmothers who never feared the sea, who waded into cold water with skirts gathered and laughter low, as if greeting an old companion. These women taught children how to float before teaching them how to pray. They said it was practical. No one argued. In other places, there were women who kept knives sharp even when there was no obvious need. Not for violence, never that, but because dull tools made them uneasy. Readiness was comfort. Readiness was rest. Captured female pirates had learned a truth most people only sense dimly, that safety is not the absence of danger, but familiarity with it. Once you know how to move inside risk, fear loosens its grip. That lesson stayed. As the centuries moved forward, the shape of punishment changed, but the shape of resistance did not. It grew smaller, quieter, harder to see. It hid inside patience, inside timing, inside the decision to wait until waiting was no longer required. These women became excellent at waiting for tides, waiting for tempers to cool, waiting for doors to open naturally instead of being forced. They understood that movement does not always mean speed. Sometimes it means endurance. In dreams, they returned to the sea not as it truly was, but as it felt, wide, rhythmic, indifferent to judgment. Their dream seas never chased them, never trapped them. They floated effortlessly, guided by nothing but instinct. They woke from these dreams peaceful, not longing. The sea had given them back something more useful than nostalgia, permission to be at ease, and so life continued. Markets opened, children grew, empires rose and collapsed again. Through it all, the legacy of captured female pirates did not shout. It breathed. It lived in the way some women refused to apologize for competence. In the way some women trusted silence more than promises. In the way some women left before being told they could not stay. No banners marked this inheritance. No songs were written clearly enough to preserve it. But it endured anyway, which was always its nature. Even now, even in this half-sleep state, The presence of those women lingers not as faces, not as events, but as a feeling of steadiness. The sense that no matter how narrow the world becomes, there is always a wider one remembered somewhere inside. The sea in this moment is barely moving. It does not sparkle. It does not roar. It simply exists, vast and untroubled, holding the accumulated lives of those who passed across it. Captured female pirates are there, not punished, not praised, just returned. Returned to the rhythm they trusted long before anyone tried to define them. And as your breathing slows, as the mind releases the need to follow each word, the story does what all good sleep stories do. It fades without ending, like a ship slipping into fog, like a tide pulling back into itself, like a woman walking away from shore without leaving footprints. Nothing more is required, nothing more will be asked. The sea keeps watch. The women rest. And sleep, deep and steady, carries everything gently forward into silence. The night stretches again, unhurried, generous, as if it knows there is still space for more quiet drifting. This is the part of sleep where stories stop trying to be stories at all. They become atmosphere, weightless, continuous, somewhere beyond memory and beyond record. The women who once lived as pirates and then lived on after capture have settled into a kind of shared stillness. Not together, not gathered, but aligned, the way distant stars are aligned without touching. They are no longer thinking about what was taken from them. That question belongs to the waking world. In this deeper place, they remember only what stayed. What stayed was the knowledge that life does not belong to rules. What stayed was the ability to move when movement mattered. What stayed was the calm that comes from having already faced the worst and survived it. Captured female pirates learned early that control is often an illusion. They watched powerful men panic in storms. They watched laws bend when money or fear was involved. They watched certainty collapse under pressure. From this, they learned flexibility, not weakness, but responsiveness. That lesson was the one no prison could remove. So even when confined, they found ways to create internal space. They counted time by breath instead of days. They memorized patterns of light. They turned repetition into rhythm, rhythm into rest, rest into resilience. This is how some of them survived long sentences without becoming hollow. They treated endurance as a voyage instead of a punishment. Each day passed like a slow mile, not exciting, not dramatic, but real. And when they were released, whether officially or simply forgotten, they stepped back into the world without ceremony. No declarations, no revenge, just movement. Movement was enough. Years later, people who met them would sense something unusual. Not danger, not bitterness. Just an ease with uncertainty. These women were rarely surprised by change. They expected it. They adjusted without complaint. They had already learned that stability is not something the world grants. It is something you build inside yourself. In some quiet homes, long after midnight, former pirates slept deeply, undisturbed by dreams. Their minds did not replay fear. Fear had been resolved long ago. Sleep came to them like a tide that knew exactly where to go, and when dreams did arrive, they were simple. A horizon. A steady wind. Hands busy with meaningful work. No battles. No capture. No trial. Only movement that made sense. The sea in these dreams was not wild. It was familiar. Like a language spoken fluently. Like a place that asks nothing extra of you. As time moved forward, these women passed on what mattered without ever naming it. They taught children to notice weather shifts, to trust their body's warnings, to leave places that felt wrong without needing justification. These teachings sounded ordinary. They were not. They were the distilled wisdom of lives lived beyond permission. Captured female pirates did not win history. History rarely rewards those who unsettle it quietly. But they did not lose either. They slipped past its grip, carried forward in subtle ways history cannot erase because it never fully sees them. Even now, in the present moment, that inheritance hums faintly. It lives in people who feel most alive near water. In people who do not confuse stillness with safety. In people who know that freedom is not always loud or visible, but it is always felt. As sleep deepens further, these thoughts no longer need to be followed. They float, they overlap, they blur. The sea becomes sound without meaning. The story becomes warmth without words. The past becomes something gentle instead of heavy. Nothing is unresolved here. The women who were captured are no longer defined by that moment. Capture was a pause, not an ending. The rest of their lives, however quiet, however ordinary, belong to them. And now even that belonging loosens, turning into rest. The tide slows. The water smooths, breath deepens. And the long night, patient and kind, keeps everything exactly where it should be, until there is no need to notice anything at all. The night remains wide, like open water with no shoreline in sight. And the story continues not because it needs to, but because drifting has become comfortable. In this depth of sleep, the women are no longer separate lives. They are a shared understanding, spread thinly across time. Not a memory you can point to, but one you can feel like knowing which way is north without looking. Captured female pirates, long removed from their chains and trials, exist here as a kind of quiet certainty. They are the certainty that survival does not require approval. In the waking world, people often ask how someone endures loss without becoming bitter. The answer was lived, not spoken, by these women. They endured by refusing to argue with what had already happened. They did not waste energy wishing for different endings. They accepted the shape of things and learned how to move within it. This was not surrender, it was navigation. Navigation is not about controlling the sea. It is about understanding it well enough to travel safely. Captured female pirates applied this same logic to life after freedom. They read moods like weather. They sensed danger before it announced itself. They knew when to stay quiet and when to leave. They did not seek comfort, they sought steadiness. And steadiness gave them rest. There were moments, especially in later years, when these women felt something close to gratitude, not for capture, not for loss, but for the clarity that followed. Once everything had been taken, there was nothing left to protect except what mattered most. That made choices simpler. Simplicity is rare. In simplicity, they found peace. They sat by windows during rain and did not feel trapped. They listened to wind without longing. They watched ships pass without envy. The sea was no longer a destination. It was a companion that lived quietly inside them. That is why the sea never truly left them. It followed them into still rooms and narrow streets. It softened their sleep. It shaped their patience. It steadied their breathing when the world felt too loud. As centuries folded over themselves, the details of their lives dissolved completely. Names disappeared. Dates blurred. Even the word pirate lost its sharpness. Sleep holds this pause gently, without urgency, without edge, letting it last as long as it needs to last. There is nowhere to go. There is nothing to resolve. Only the soft certainty that some lives, no matter how constrained or misunderstood, remain expansive to the very end and beyond. And with that certainty, the night deepens once more, smooth and quiet, like water at slack tide, carrying nothing, needing nothing, simply being. The pause stretches, but it does not break. It becomes the kind of silence that feels full rather than empty, like standing on a deck at dawn before anyone else wakes. The water barely moves. The air holds. Nothing is waiting to happen, and that is what makes it safe. In this calm, the last traces of effort slip away. The women who once lived sharp, watchful lives, who measured every glance, every order, every risk, no longer need to measure anything at all. There's no vigilance here, no readiness. Even readiness has been set down gently. Like a tool that has done its work well, what remains is presence. Presence without purpose. Being without proving. Rest without explanation. This is something they were never granted while awake. Captured female pirates spent so much of their lives being defined by what they were not allowed to be, not respectable, not obedient, not forgettable enough. Even after capture, even after silence, the world kept trying to label them, to contain them inside narrow meanings. But meanings fade here. Here, there are only sensations: cool air, slow breath, a sense of width that does not need edges. If you listen closely, you might feel the echo of a heartbeat that matches the water's rhythm. Not fast, not slow, just steady. This steadiness is what carried them through everything: storms, trials, cells, long ordinary years. Steadiness is rarely celebrated. It does not make noise. And yet it lasts. In this final drifting, the sea does not separate past from present. All moments lie side by side, softened. A woman steering through fog exists alongside the same woman decades later, sitting quietly with folded hands. Neither moment is more true than the other. They are simply different tides of the same life. Sleep understands this kind of layering. That is why it feels timeless. That is why it heals without instruction. As the night deepens even further, the sense of self loosens. The story is no longer about pirates or women or history. It is about movement becoming stillness without losing meaning. Like a wave becoming part of the ocean. Like a journey becoming a place. Nothing is lost in this change. Everything is kept just differently. The captured women are not watching now. They are not remembering. They are not enduring. They are resting in a way that does not require strength. And you, drifting with them, do not need to follow anything anymore. The words can pass by without being held. The images can blur. The sea can become nothing more than a sound that blends into breath. The night holds steady, sleep deepens. And the story, having given all it needed to give, dissolves softly into quiet without ending. Without beginning again, simply continuing as rest. The arrival lingers, and even that word begins to feel unnecessary. There is no sense of having reached a place because there is no longer a sense of distance. Everything is close now, everything is here. The night does not surround you, it rests with you, the way water rests against something that belongs in it. In this softness, time loosens completely. Minutes and hours stop lining up, past and future stop facing each other. There is only a long, gentle present, wide enough to hold every life without sorting them. The women who once lived sharp-edged lives feel this first. They recognize it instinctively. After years of alertness, of listening for danger, of reading every shift in wind and mood, this deep stillness feels almost unfamiliar, and then it feels right. It feels like setting down a weight you didn't realize you were still carrying. Here, no one asks who you were before or after. No one asks what you lost or what you endured. No one asks for explanations, confessions, or courage. The questions themselves dissolve, the way salt dissolves in water still present, but no longer separate. Captured female pirates no longer remember capture as a moment. It has softened into a texture like rough cloth worn smooth over time. It no longer hurts to touch. Their lives, once split into before and after, now feel whole again, not because the past changed, but because it no longer needs to be defended. Wholeness does not argue. It rests. If there is movement here, it is internal and slow. A subtle settling. A quiet alignment. Like a tide finding its level without being told where to stop. The sea is no longer something outside the body. It feels more like breath rising and falling without effort, reliable, unremarkable, perfect in its steadiness. This is where vigilance finally ends. No watching, no listening for threats. No readiness required. Just being held by something that does not judge what you once had to become. The night stretches on, kind and unbroken. It does not try to wake you. It does not try to take you anywhere else. It is content to stay exactly like this, calm and wide, as long as you need. And so the story does not conclude. It simply grows quieter, quieter than words, quieter than memory, quieter than the idea of rest itself. Until even quiet fades into something softer, still and ease so complete it no longer has a name. Only a feeling steady and deep, like water that knows it will never need to move again, unless it wants to. The night closes its hand gently. Nothing snaps shut. Nothing ends sharply. The story does not tie itself into a final knot, because knots are for holding on and there is nothing left to hold. The women who once sailed, once fought, once endured capture and consequence, have been carried far beyond names and outcomes. What happened to them has softened into what became of them. Calm, depth, and an unshakable inner freedom that no force ever truly reached. The sea does not keep score. Sleep does not demand meaning, but both simply hold. And in that holding, everything settles exactly as it should. The long lives, the lost ships, the erased records, the quiet survival, all of it rests without weight. There is no need to remember. There is no need to forget. Only stillness remains. Breath moves easily. The body is safe. The mind is quiet. The tide has turned and returned and now lies smooth, endless, complete. And so the story concludes the way the sea does at night, without ceremony, without noise, leaving behind only rest, deep and undisturbed, as sleep fully takes over.